Sometimes in your search for happiness, you ponder the meaning of your life.
What is the answer to this great riddle, this enigma of the past?
Who am I? How did I come to be?
I don't have all the answers.
Look at all the innocent people.
People glorious and arrogant, valiant and headstrong.
Good people, happy people who live quiet lives and love each other.
Who suffer through no fault of their own except that they just happen to be alive.
I never dreamed you could be so bitter.
It must be, so that we can grow.
Huh?
And he sees in front of him all the inequities and inhumanities that humans perpetrate on other humans.
What is the answer?
It is a tale of a man and a monster.
All right, welcome back to the History of Being Human podcast. I am the host, Noel Armstrong. As always, thank you for listening. Today I'm going to continue along our origins timeline. In this episode, I'm going to pick up that thin, tenuous thread of life that we've been covering and follow it all the way from the earliest forms of life right up until the last common ancestor between humans and chimpanzees. I covered quite a bit in this episode. As far as topics go, I have to say this was one of my favorites. I found the material fascinating, and I learned a lot of what I consider very important things, like what a monotreme is, where lactation comes from. But I also left out things that in hindsight, I wish I would have included. One of those things that I wish I would have talked about is warm-bloodedness itself. This key feature of mammal and bird metabolisms needs to be addressed. Now, it's also good news that I didn't talk about warm-bloodedness yet, because since this episode came out, there's new information that totally changes our understanding of when warm-bloodedness entered, shall we call it, the gene pool. And so I'm going to begin by covering that topic. When did warm-bloodedness first begin? And for a long time, scientists would attempt to answer that question by appealing to external features like fur, feathers. A more flexible spine could actually be evidence of warm-bloodedness, because an animal with fur has to clean it, and so their spine has to be more flexible. Along with that, of course, there is the growth pattern within the animal's bones themselves. So if you look at rings on a tree, you can see how old a tree is. Well, animal bones also have annular rings, and using these rings, scientists can tell roughly how long it took them to grow. Warm-blooded animals tend to grow much more quickly than cold-blooded animals. So using methods like that, scientists arrived at a date about 250 million years in the past. And so for a long time, that was the estimate of when warm-bloodedness showed up in the fossil record, 250 million years ago. Now let's fast forward to last year, 2022. A paleontologist named Romain David did his PhD dissertation on semicircular canals. Those are the inner ear structures that are full of a viscous fluid that kind of tells you where you are in space. You can tell a lot about an animal's movement patterns by studying their semicircular canals. As he was studying these semicircular canals, these inner ear structures, he noticed something very important. When the semicircular canals are subject to temperature fluctuations, so in other words, if an animal can't regulate its body temperature, a cold-blooded animal has to have larger semicircular canals. And the reason for that is there's a fluid that moves through those canals. And if it gets cold, it becomes more viscous. It doesn't move as well. So when that fluid becomes cold and doesn't move as well, if their semicircular canals are too small, then as the fluid inside their ears gets colder, it can't move freely. It becomes too dense. Now contrast that with warm-blooded animals. They can regulate their body temperature. They don't have to worry about the endolymph in their semicircular canals getting cold and becoming much more viscous. They can keep it warm all the time. Consequently, they can have much smaller, narrower semicircular canals that still function just as well. When David was researching this, he studied hundreds of living animals and found that that does indeed seem to hold. Warm-blooded animals, as a general rule, have smaller semicircular canals than cold-blooded animals. He then applied those findings to the fossil record and came up with 64 distinct species that he could test, that he could see enough of the remaining bone anatomy to extrapolate how large their semicircular canals had been. What he found was that about 233 million years ago, the age between the non-mammal synapsids and what are called the mammaliomorphs, those very early proto-mammals, that's when the semicircular canal size changed. He said, and many agree, that this is very strong evidence that that's basically the time when warm-bloodedness can be conclusively demonstrated in the fossil record because of that semicircular canal change. So the new number, the first evidence we have of warm-bloodedness, comes from about 233 million years ago, with a group of creatures called mammaliomorphs, early proto-mammals. That means it's about 20 million years more recent than had been previously supposed. In fact, there was an argument over whether or not Dimetrodon, that famous sail-backed, lizard-looking synapsid, many scientists wondered if that could have been the first warm-blooded creature. But if Romain David's research is correct, then Dimetrodon's semicircular canals much better match a cold-blooded animal than a warm-blooded one, meaning that Dimetrodon, one of the early synapsids, the most famous early synapsid, was not warm-blooded. And frankly, if all of this synapsid talk seems unfamiliar, listen to the episode coming up. I'll explain what they are and what their importance is evolutionarily. So what I'm going to try to do is get us up to the time of the hominins, and I'll explain what that is soon. I'm going to be winding up that part of our origin story from the perspective of a paleontologist, anthropologist, archaeologist, primatologist of the 21st century. So today I want to begin with mammals. I want to go through to primates, then to hominins, and end up with modern humans. Pretty complicated subject, so I'm going to try to keep it big picture. Then go into some of the individual species when time allows. But before I begin, I want to define some terms, because I'm using some terms that might not be familiar to you. And the first term is hominid, with a D at the end. A hominid is every living and extinct great ape. It's gorillas, orangutans, chimps, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, us, all of them. So when you look at a chimpanzee, you're looking at a hominid. When you look at a gorilla, you're looking at a hominid. Even an orangutan, a more distant relative to us, is a hominid. Now this next term I'm going to introduce, I want you to just forget, so sorry about this, but there's a term called a hominine, and a hominine is all the great apes that came from Africa. So it's that whole category of hominids that I just talked about, all the great apes except gibbons. But a hominine are the apes that came from Africa. So essentially, if you split off orangutans, Gigantopithecus, Sevapithecus, which we'll talk about those, if you split those off and just talk about the African ape families, those are the hominines. Now, within that family, we have the term hominins. And this is the term that I've been using quite a bit. The hominins, spelled Hominins. And this is just a special little tribe, kind of an exclusive club. That's just humans and their closest relatives. So anything more closely related to us than a chimpanzee is a hominin. And so when you hear the word hominins, you're talking about all of the ancestral humans that you see in museums and us. The reason I point that out is because when I use the term hominin, I'm just talking about that special little group of humans and their closest relatives. Now, every other hominin on the planet is dead but us. And that's what I was talking about with Dr. Carr. If these big brains are so advantageous, why is everybody dead but us? The short answer is we might have just outcompeted and killed them all. But we'll talk about them, we'll talk about what happened in the next episode. You know, there was a time about, 50 years ago, when every non-human hominin, every fossil that they had, could fit on a dinner table, all of them together. That's why there was this idea of a missing link that we hadn't found yet, the link between apes and humans. You don't hear much about that missing link anymore, because there are many, many links. In fact, as of about 10 years ago, they had over 200 skulls. This is 10 years ago. 200 skulls, nearly complete skulls from extinct hominins. They had partial remains from more than 6,000 individuals. Not 6,000 species, 6,000 individual specimens. And this was 10 years ago. So who knows what that number is now? So we have to say that's a lot of links. And of course, the whole idea of a missing link is kind of a fiction anyway. It's not like there was one species and then another kind of ticking away like a digital clock. We'll talk about speciation a little later in the episode. But suffice to say that we have many, many possible links, but we don't know which of these were on a divergent path. We don't know how many of these were ancestral to us. And we certainly can't put a limit on the number of species that are going to turn up as more and more fossils are unearthed. So, very briefly, from last episode, fish arose 530 million years ago. Roughly, of course, all these numbers could change, but fish arose about 530 million years ago during the Cambrian explosion. You remember that explosion of life on the planet during the Cambrian era. And about 160 million years after that, so by 370 million years ago, more specialized fish were forming in the small stagnant pools, these pools that would dry up and become mud holes. And some of the fish had evolved a capability to breathe oxygen from the atmosphere. And those fish, these lungfish, were actually able to survive when other species would die out as the oxygen content dropped. This gave rise to the first amphibians, creatures who could actually breathe air, who began their life in the water, then moved out onto the land. As the lungs became more developed and more specialized, they could no longer even breathe the water as they became adults. So they're born underwater, they move out onto the land, they breathe oxygen, and then when it's time to lay eggs, they lay the eggs in the water and the whole cycle begins again. These are the amphibians. And again, they were about 370 million years ago. So the next development comes pretty quickly, about 320 million years ago. In some of these swampy areas, some of the amphibians begin to spend more and more time on the land. In fact, they spend their entire lives on the land. They develop more and more specializations to allow them to survive. Skin that's impermeable, so it retains moisture better. Their young are born from their eggs with lungs that are capable of breathing on land, and these are the first reptiles, about 50 million years after the first amphibians. Now, one thing that I think is fascinating, in Nova Scotia, they turned up a fossil, a rock, that's 315 million years old, and on this rock you can see the skittering of little reptile feet. So reptiles arose about 320 million years ago. We have the first fossil evidence of reptile feet skittering across a rock 315 million years ago. Now, very soon after the first reptiles arose, so by about, well, in geologic time, very soon, by about 300 million years ago, they split into two groups. One group was called the synapsids. They had one hole in their skull behind their eye. This hole in the skull behind the eye created a little arch around the eye, and they called them synapsids, which means fused arch. Now, these synapsids included mammal-like reptiles, and this branch actually gave rise to the mammals. By the way, we're all synapsids. We don't have that hole in the skull behind the eye anymore. It's been modified. It's closed over with it's kind of a thin layer of bone, but it's that depression in our skull behind our eye where our chewing muscles originate. So even without the skull hole, we're synapsids. We still have evidence of our proud heritage. The other branch was called diapsids, by the way. That reptile branch gave rise to all the crocodiles, lizards, snakes, turtles, and then, of course, dinosaurs and birds, which we'll talk about briefly. So these early synapsids were reptile-like mammals. I just call them reptomammals. It's not a term that anybody uses scientifically, but I think it fits. They're the reptomammals. They lay their eggs on land, and their eggs are leathery, kind of parchment-like. So this parchment can dry out very easily. Something has to be done to protect the eggs from desiccation. So as these reptomammals are sitting on their eggs, between their little scales, they are secreting some kind of leather conditioner, something to keep those parchment-like eggs from drying out and desiccating. So they're just leaking this kind of oily glandular substance onto their eggs from between those reptomammal scales of theirs. So why am I giving you this information? It's because those glands, over vast periods of time, they become more and more nutritious in what they excrete. That leather conditioner becomes more and more nutritious. And when the little reptomammals are born, they start to lick, it's terrible, but they start to lick that out from between the scales. And it is nutritious. It helps them grow. It helps them develop. Okay, so you probably know where this is going. Those pores tend to accumulate into areas of high concentration. They have little hair follicles associated with them. And those little areas of high concentration will be where the little reptomammals, the little synapsids, come and lick up that nutritious substance. And as they coalesce more and more over time, this becomes the earliest form of lactation. So the glands accumulate even though there isn't a specific nipple, there's an area of high concentration where the animals can come lick up their milk. So this is the early history of lactation. And lactation is the hallmark of mammals. Even mammals that don't have nipples, like platypus, echidnas, they have lactation glands concentrated into certain areas where their young can lick it up. So they still lactate. They still nourish their young with milk. So these creatures that don't have nipples, that are kind of proto-mammals, they're furry, they're called monotremes. The word monotreme means single hole, one hole. Now, why are they called this? You might know this, but birds have a cloaca. And through this cloaca, they defecate, they urinate. In other words, they poop and pee from the same hole, they lay eggs. And that's what these monotremes, these single-hole mammals do. They just have one hole. They have no nipples, and yet they're mammals because they lactate and they nourish their young with that milk. Now, marsupials come along as well sometime in this time frame. Marsupials also give birth to very underdeveloped young. They're not still in eggs like the monotremes, but they're much more underdeveloped than most mammals, and so they have to survive inside of a pouch in their mother's belly. These are marsupials. The word marsupial just means pouch. You're all wondering, marsupials have two holes. Only the monotremes have one hole. And the time frame when exactly monotremes and marsupials first appeared is not clear, but by 165 million years ago. So remember, the synapsids, the reptomammals, came around 300 million years ago. And 135 million years later, we have the first true mammals, what we call eutherian mammals. And it's such a judgmental term, really, because EU, means good, and therian means beast, so these are the good beasts. I guess all the other beasts are the bad beasts, or the not-so-good beasts. So without a placenta, you're not a good beast. So the good beasts arrive on the scene 165 million years ago with their placentas. And of course, this is when belly buttons are introduced on the planet. So a very important date. Along with the belly button, what does it mean to be a mammal? Mammals are warm-blooded, we know that. They also have something called the neocortex, the new outer layer of the brain. That's a region where there's cognition, language, spatial reasoning. You hear about the lizard brain before the neocortex evolved within mammals, before the new outer layer evolved in mammals. That more ancient lizard part of the brain is involved in basic survival mechanisms. And you can remember those survival mechanisms, the functions of the lizard brain with 6 F's. It's that fight, flight, feed, fear, freeze, and fornicate. But now we have this extra layer. We have this new bark. So cortex is a confusing word. When you talk about the neocortex, people often think the root word of cortex is the core or the center. But in anatomy, that's the opposite, because cortex is actually the Latin word for bark, that stuff on the outside of a tree. So the cortex is the outer layer in anatomical terms. So the neocortex is the new outer layer of the brain. And this new souped up outer layer of our brains gave us a lot of capabilities, a lot of things that lizards can't do. So for example, it allows you voluntary control over your instinctive behaviors. There are times where you want to run away, but you don't. You have courage. You think about it. Sometimes your curiosity can overcome fear. Think what a great survival advantage that would confer upon a species. Times we want to lash out in anger, but you don't. You restrain yourself. All of those things are controlled by the neocortex. And the cash value of that is that mammals are able to establish a much more complex social order, a much more stable social order. Of course, we have to admit that impulse control varies from species to species, and it varies dramatically within a given species, but that's the idea behind it. Now, what else defines a mammal? Well, interestingly, there are 3 bones in the middle ear, of every single mammal. And these 3 middle ear bones greatly increase mammal sensitivity to higher frequency sounds. So these 3 middle ear bones represent a significant upgrade in hearing capability for mammals. And we'll talk about why that might have been in just a second here. The other thing about mammals, of course, is that they have breasts. In fact, the word mama, the Latin word, simply means breast. So think about it. We have an entire class of animals to which we belong, basically named the breasts. So that's the mammals. That's us. Now, these are mostly small animals when they first develop. Okay, remember, they're dinosaurs, large lizards, dangerous predators roaming the earth around this time. Some of the key mammalian traits developed because these creatures had to come out at night in order to avoid becoming a meal for a dinosaur or a pterosaur or something else. So that explains traits like their keen hearing. Those 3 bones, those high-frequency sounds that they could hear, conferred a significant survival benefit on them. They also have sensory whiskers. Think about how many mammals have whiskers. And these sensory whiskers allow them to move around in the dark much more effectively. They also have more rods than cones in their eyes, so they have much more night vision capability built into the design of their eyes. And so even though these are just kind of small niche creatures, they do very well. They survive very well. They're well adapted to the demands of their environment, and they survive in that basic form for about 100 million years until what we talked about last time, the KT extinction event, the Cretaceous tertiary extinction event about 65 million years ago, the one that wiped out all the dinosaurs. And think about it, these little vermin, little mouse-like, rodent-like creatures are skulking around in their holes, coming out at night so they don't get eaten. And then all of a sudden an asteroid flies out of the sky, smashes into the shallow water off the Yucatan Peninsula. And as a result of the changes that take place after that, every single four-legged animal over 25 kilograms, except crocodiles and some turtles, all the big, dangerous, mammal-eating dinosaurs essentially, are gone, leaving only the birds. The mammals could not have planned this any better. Incipe regni mammalibus, begin the reign of the mammals. And that's exactly what happened. They start to get bigger, they start to diversify, they start to take over ecological niches that used to be filled by the dinosaurs. They don't have to sneak or crawl or fly below the radar of everything else any longer. So I guess in a way we should thank the universe for sending that rock to crash into the Yucatan, because without that, we'd still be small, sneaky, opportunistic vermin. But since that asteroid came, now we're large, sneaky, opportunistic vermin. How large did they get? Well, Paraceratherium was about 40 feet long, weighed 20 tons. It was huge and massive. You know, an elephant can weigh about 6.5 tons. Andrewsarchus, the largest predator that ever lived, at least mammalian predator, this weird-looking wolf thing that was about 13 feet long and probably weighed 2,000 pounds. So they got very large. But when you compare that to a T-Rex that weighed about 32,000 pounds possibly, you can see that they wouldn't have been much competition. In fact, the Paraceratherium would probably have made a nice meal for a T-Rex. So you can see how the apex predators among the dinosaurs kind of had to get out of the way to allow mammals to become megafauna also. So the mammals are developing, they're growing, they're getting bigger, they're spreading out, they're filling all these different niches. The next thing we have to talk about are the primates. The first proto-primates start to arrive sometime after that KT extinction, around 65 million years ago. What's different about these proto-primates? Well, they have more flexibility in their shoulders and in their hips. They have more grasping ability with their hands. They're designed to be flexible and dexterous and to move through the trees. And one thing that I forgot to mention when I was talking about how large mammals became, when did that occur? Well, the actual massive enlargement of the mammals did not happen right around 65 million years ago, right after that extinction event. It takes a while for a species to fill these niches and start to increase in size. I think we talked about that on a previous episode. But something happens in what's called the Eocene period, when we see this dramatic increase in not only the size of mammals, but also in the complexity of their brain. And the theory is that oxygen levels are rising during this period after the KT extinction. You can see the oxygen levels climb from 18, 20, 21, 23%. I think they spike at 23%. Just for your information, the oxygen level is currently around 21% at sea level. But it spikes at about 23%, and there's some thought that that allows for the development of larger mammals with larger brains. I would say that's controversial. It's not something that everybody agrees on, but it's an interesting idea, and I think worth mentioning. So around 55 million years ago, we have the first true primates. They have large brains, forward-facing eyes so that they have stereoscopic vision to enable them to grasp tree branches safely. They have short snouts, flexible joints, and very complicated social orders. Primates have the most complex social orders with hierarchies that are pretty well understood. They have episodes of like collusion. They have coups within their troop. So they have a lot of intrigue going on within their social order. And that's thought to accompany their larger brains. So these true primates, 55 million years ago. But keep in mind, they're not monkeys. These are what's called prosimians. So they're lemurs, lorises, animals like that. By about 34 million years ago, the first monkeys arrive on the scene. These are larger than the prosimians. They're smarter, of course. They also have smaller snouts, still less and less dog-like with their snout. And they become increasingly flexible at the shoulder girdle and the hips. They can move around much more rapidly. They outcompete the prosimians and take over many of the niches where these animals were living. Then by about 30 million years ago, you have the first New World monkeys. How did the monkeys get to the New World? They started in the Old World, in Eurasia and Africa, And the thought is that they got on some flotsam. Basically, there's these huge clumps of dirt and foliage. And the Atlantic Ocean was a little smaller then than it is now. The Atlantic Ocean is getting bigger all the time, by the way. So they floated over from Africa to South America, and that gave rise to the first species of New World monkeys. Now, let's go back to the Old World. The first monkeys come on the scene by about 34 million years ago. They outcompete the prosimians, probably eat them for all I know. But even when it seems like the monkeys are winning, and winning big, there are changes happening in the climate, in the terrain, that are going to have important consequences. From 33 to about 23 million years ago, there's this expansion of grasslands, of savannas, and the broadleaf forests, the leafy forests, the jungles are receding. So at about 23 million years ago, we enter a period of time known as the Miocene. The Miocene is marked by a planet that's cooling, leafy tree forests, jungles that are receding, savannas, in other words grasslands, are expanding and taking over some of the areas that the monkeys used to live. The world is changing. Different traits become more useful. So for example, what's the use of a tail if you live on a savanna? So you lose the tail. You have to be more mobile on the ground. You have to be able to move around on the ground, not just up in trees. And also, if you're living on a savanna, you're living in a tall grassland, think what an advantage it would be to be able to stand up and to look over the top of the grass. The animal that can do that is going to see the predator first, and the animal that can't is going to get a nasty surprise. It's going to walk right up on something. So pretty much every one of those changes that I just detailed was ecologically driven and had to do with the development of the first apes. So the apes came around 20 million years ago. They diverged from Old World monkeys. The representative species of that transition from monkey to ape, the missing link, except that it's found, is called the proconsul. Now, proconsul is not a Roman magistrate, although it is that too. But in the early 1900s, when the fossils of this species, the proconsul, were identified first, consul is the name that they gave to chimpanzees performing in circus acts and in, for example, London museums. So proconsul meant the species before chimpanzees. The proconsul species were very successful. They lived between 20 and 14 million years ago, toward the middle of the Miocene era. Now, by about 14 million years ago, during the middle Miocene, the group of apes that included our ancestors is living on the edges of the expanding savanna, at the border between the forests and the savannas in southern Europe. And they were very likely members of a genus called Dryopithecus. That means tree ape, by the way. Dryopithecus looked essentially just like modern African apes. And soon after that, about 12 million years ago, 2 million years after Dryopithecus fossils, we see fossils of an ape called Sivapithecus or Ramapithecus. You know, Rama and Shiva are Hindu gods. You can imagine these are Indian subcontinent fossils. And as the Miocene progresses, the temperature gets colder, and these apes that are living in southern Europe are going to get pushed to the south. Dryopithecus species get pushed down into Africa. Ramapithecus or Shivapithecus get pushed down into India. And at about 12 million years ago, that lineage, that Sivapithecus lineage, that would eventually become orangutans, splits away from all the African apes. So that's when that occurred. That's when the ancestors of orangutans broke off from the African apes. And they did give rise to some very interesting species, like Gigantopithecus. If you've ever seen the Jungle Book, the Disney version, there's that Gigantopithecus, that very huge-looking orangutan. It's actually pretty correct anatomically, it's just oversized. Had teeth and mandibles that have been recovered, and its teeth and mandibles are much larger than any gorilla. So much so that the estimate is that they could have been 9 to 10 feet tall. They could have weighed over 1,000 pounds. Certainly possible, but it's hard to establish that when all you have is mandibles and teeth. I don't know where their long bones are. It's possible they could have just had giant chins on pygmy bodies. They could have been little... What's that guy in Shrek, the little Lord Farquaad of apes? Nobody knows because we don't have any of their long bones, but the estimate is, based on their jaws, they were massive, the biggest apes ever. And they are closely related to orangutans, closer than they are to us or to the African species. And by the way, if you're wondering, there were European apes also, European ape species, but they're all dead and they didn't leave any descendants. So because orangutans are still around, we're talking about the Asian apes breaking away from the African apes. Let's go back to Africa because we're chasing our earliest, nearest, dearest relatives. Going back to Africa, there's still the Dryopithecus species living 12 million years ago. At about 8 to 9 million years ago, Dryopithecines diverge. And one line goes off to become gorillas. The other line goes to chimps, bonobos, and us. Now this is important. The take-home message here is important to remember. We think of ourselves as a wholly different species, different from every other animal on the planet, and different in a way that places us farther from every other species of ape than those ape species are from each other, but that's simply not the case. The take-home here is that we're more closely related to chimps than we are to gorillas, and chimpanzees are more closely related to humans than they are to gorillas. We're closer to chimps and they're closer to us than either one of us are to gorillas, or for that matter orangutans and everything else. And we've talked before about the fact that we share almost 99% of our DNA with chimpanzees. We share about 98% of our DNA with gorillas, so they're not far behind. And if you're interested, we share about 90% of our DNA with mice, 84% with dogs. You can look all this stuff up. I'm getting off topic. I want to go back to the discussion at hand. And I hope you'll forgive me. I want to introduce one more concept. All the names and all the dates that we've been talking about are interesting, but I think the big picture, the concepts are much more important. And this concept that I want to talk about is speciation. Speciation is the process by which new species arise out of existing ones. All of these splits that I've been talking about, they conjure up images of a mother chimpanzee sometime in the past. She gives birth to 2 offspring, and one of her babies looks just like her, just like a chimp, and the other one happens to look like, Abraham Lincoln. Completely different. And then we have a split. And then from then on, the Lincoln line continues and the chimpanzee line goes another direction. That's not at all how it happens, and I'm sure you know that. What really happens is the process of speciation. It's a long, drawn-out process by which new species are formed. Populations move away, so they separate geographically or in some other way. They inhabit different regions, and then their DNA starts to evolve separately over hundreds of thousands or even millions of years, until at last they're reproductively isolated, meaning they can no longer breed and produce sexually potent viable offspring. And that's the process of speciation. But over that time, over that long drawn-out time where they're gradually diverging from each other, there's a long period of time where, if these populations were able to breed, they would still be reproductively compatible. They could still give birth to viable offspring of their own that were still capable of reproducing. So there's a lot of cross-breeding, a lot of back and forth, even as populations are diverging, that makes it very difficult to get this clear-cut date or event when a population diverges, unless there is some kind of massive cataclysmic separation of populations. So there are a lot of hybrids, a lot of crossbreeds in nature. The red wolf is thought to be a crossbreed between the gray wolf and coyotes, and it's a completely different species than either one of them. A little bit closer to us, what's more near and dear to us, is the fact that most of us have a significant percentage of Neanderthal DNA. Only descendants of people from sub-Saharan Africa have no Neanderthal DNA. I think we talked about that earlier. Asians and Europeans have 1 to 4% of Neanderthal DNA in their genome. So in areas where Homo sapiens could come into contact with Neanderthals, there was some crossbreeding. The point of this is, when I say that gorillas diverged from the group that would become chimpanzees and humans, it didn't happen as a split. It's not an event, it's a process. And that process probably went on for about 2 million years. They start to diverge at about 10 million years ago. By 8 million years ago, we have the last common ancestor between humans and gorillas, and from then on, they're completely separate lines. The thought is that the more closely related two species are, the more recently they diverge. So for example, humans and chimps are very closely related. We had our last common ancestor possibly around 4 or 5 million years ago. The farther apart the relationship is, the farther back in prehistory that occurred. So for example, when did toadstools diverge from rhinoceri? Well, that was a long, long time ago. So back to the topic at hand. The hominins, that little group we talked about, of our very, very closest relatives, all of whom are extinct except us, the hominins began diverging from the line that would become chimps and bonobos as early as 10 million years ago. But through crossbreeding and hybridization, there was no absolutely clear-cut separation of these species until about 4 or 5 million years ago. So the last common ancestor between humans and chimpanzees lived about 4 to 5 million years ago. And during part of that time when we were diverging from chimps, we were also diverging from gorillas. So the end result is that our genetic relationships to these different animals is not clear-cut. It's not cut and dried. There's no flow chart that branches neatly that you can follow. And in consequence, our DNA is kind of messy too. There are parts of bonobo DNA, parts of chimp DNA, parts of gorilla DNA, and the parts that we share with bonobos we don't share with chimps, and parts that chimps share with gorillas they don't share with us, and so forth, because all of it is a little bit messy. Species are diverging from several other species, sometimes at the same time, and there's cross-breeding between these species. So that's my little lecture about speciation. It's probably one of those topics that I think is interesting that only 2 or 3 other people on the whole planet think is interesting, but it does help us understand our DNA a little better. Okay, with that I want to review very briefly how we got here, how we got to hominins, because I have just finished up with the line that would become chimpanzees and bonobos diverging from the hominins about 4 million years ago. They have a last common ancestor, possibly 5. And remember, every one of these numbers are subject to dramatic and unexpected changes. But just to review, in the big picture, single-cell life, 3.8 billion years ago. Multi-cell life took 2 billion more years after that till it formed. Fish, the first fish fossils, come up in the Cambrian explosion from about 530 million years ago. Amphibians, 370 million years ago. Reptiles, 320 million years ago. Synapsids, remember what synapsids are. They would become us, reptomammals, 300 million years ago, just 20 million years after the reptiles. Monotremes, those animals with no placenta, no nipple, they have a single hole, but they're still warm-blooded and they still lactate. They were sometime between 300 and 165 million years ago. So that's a broad range. We really don't know exactly when they came on the scene. Marsupials, those mammals with no placenta still, but they have a pouch and they now have nipples. Marsupials, by the way, mark the very apex, the culmination of cuteness on this planet. And they arose sometime between 200 million and 165 million years ago. They're still the cutest things around. True mammals, 165 million years ago, meaning mammals that have a placenta, that have a belly button. So belly buttons come on the scene 165 million years ago. Now, primate evolution begins really in earnest at the KT extinction event. When the dinosaurs are wiped out, we start to see evidence of these proto-primates, these early primate-like creatures, 65 million years ago. True primates, 55 million years ago, those squirrel-like little fellas. Monkeys, 34 million years ago in the old world. Then they floated to America by about 30 million years ago. Apes in the old world, 20 million years ago, the first apes. Dryopithecus, that African precursor ape, 14 million years ago. The split to the Indian subcontinent, Sivapithecus, that would become orangutans and Gigantopithecus, that happened 12 million years ago. So we are now to the point 12 million years ago where there's a group of apes in Africa and a separate group in the Indian subcontinent. And of course, the next process of division occurs when gorillas between 10 and 8 million years ago branch off from the group that would become hominins. And then finally, chimpanzees between 10 and 5 million years ago are separating away from the group that would become hominins. So our last common ancestor with the chimpanzees is about 5 million years ago. With that little review, I'm done with this episode. Thank you for listening.